I'm going to cover really not all the history of Coconut Creek. I don't know if, I hope audio-visual, but not okay?
Yeah, it is.
All right. But the founding of Coconut Creek and what led up to the founding of Coconut Creek. In other words, why is there a Coconut Creek? Get that off of there. And I'd like to say, first of all, thank all the people over the years who have contributed to our understanding of this. A lot of them are gone, but a lot of them have been very helpful in that. I know Becky was able to acquire the Lucille Brown photographic collection, which is
actually the best at Elf Rose.
Oh, okay.
Some of them on Lucille's might have been there, but most of them are at Wilson Jacks.
Yeah. So anyway, I'd like to start off that way and talk about the early history of Coconut Creek. Oops, not quite bad. Let's go a while ago, but not that far back. And really, the history of South Florida as a populated area is due to this man, Henry Flagler, who in 1896 brought the Florida East Coast Railway down from West Palm Beach to Miami. And along the way, many of the towns and cities that we know today, Fort Lauderdale, Pompano Beach, Deerfield, Boca, in this section, got their start primarily as agricultural communities. In fact, Henry Flagler, there was a letter that he wrote, and he said he was in Miami, and he saw great prospect for a tourist development in Miami. And he said, the other areas between West Palm Beach and Miami might be good for agriculture, but he didn't see any prospect for anything else. He didn't live long enough. Moving forward, most of the farming that went on in the very early years was near the railroad track, because that was where the high ground was. It wasn't too far west of what is today Dixie Highway that the Everglades began back in the early 20th century. But in 1919, a man by the name of Hiram Hammond decided to farm farther west. In fact, it was so far west that no one could believe that he would even venture to do it. And he had to build his own road to get to his farmland and build a village for the farm workers. That man, Hiram Hammond, the road was Hammondville Road, which has been completely, all sections of it are now changed names, Martin Luther King Boulevard and Coconut Creek Boulevard. And his farm, so far west of population centers, is now where Margate is. There were a lot of other farmers, particularly during the Great Depression. A lot of people lost their land, but this gave farmers a chance to grow more crops, purchase land farther and farther west. And in what is today Coconut Creek, there were quite a few farmers. This was R.B. Jones. All of them lived in Pompano. R.B. Jones, he had huge tracts of land in what is today North Coconut Creek, particularly around the area of 441 and Hillsborough Boulevard. He also had land in Palm Beach County, which is now Sandalfoot. Glenn Collier, or as he was known, Glenny Collier, he farmed primarily bell peppers, and he claimed to have the sweetest bell peppers that were grown in South Florida. Where he grew those peppers is now Coconut Creek Plaza on the corner of Lyons Road and Coconut Creek Parkway. Of course, Bud Lyons, we all know Lyons Road. He was the largest landowning farmer in Broward County at one time. In fact, almost most of what is today Coral Springs was land that he owned for cattle grazing. But he owned a lot of land in Coconut Creek as well. The farming was made possible in this area by the State Farmers Market in Pompano Beach. It's still there. If you go down, I'm going to keep calling it Hammondville Road just because of the historic character of it. If you go down Hammondville Road, it's still there. It's now the Myrick State Farmers Market after one of the brokers. But this was a huge enterprise that really supported the farming and agriculture in this area. The farmers had pushed their fields farther and farther west, but it became kind of dangerous as they moved into lower and lower land. And in 1947, they paid for it. In 1947, 2 wet hurricanes hit South Florida. On September 17th, a Category 4 hit between Miami and Fort Lauderdale. And on October 19th, a Category 2 hit the area. In dumping between those two and just regular rainy weather, over 100 inches. And that's, what, 8.5 feet? 100 inches were dropped on South Florida, flooding all the farmland and almost everything except the high ridge where the FEC Railroad is and Dixie Highway. This led to people saying, we got to do something about this. So in 1948, the U.S. Congress established the Central and Southern Florida Project, which was a drainage project. A drainage project that started just south of Orlando and went all the way to Florida Bay, or the Florida City area, creating dikes and canals to channel the water away from the farmland. But in a sort of ironic situation, having protected the farmlands, it made that land possible for other uses such as development. And one of the first developers west of the old legacy cities in the east part of Broward County, in the north, was Jack Marquesi. Marquesi had worked in Fort Lauderdale and built Melrose Park, which some of you are familiar with that area. But he liked the idea of doing something on his own where he didn't have to worry about a city commission and zoning ordinances and inspections and things like that. So he bought a lot of land where the old Hammond farms were and started to build his own city, Margate. This was also enhanced by, in 1957, the Florida Turnpike, then called the Sunshine State Parkway, being built and having a western exit at exactly the same place that it is today. You probably will rarely see in the daylight that few cars on the Turnpike today. There were a few people with as agriculture began to diminish, there were a few people who were still living in this area, actually lived in this area. This may be the oldest house in Coconut Creek. It was built in the early 40s. It is still standing, although looks nothing like it did then. I wish I had brought a picture of that today. This was built, owned by the Tompkins family in the early 40s, and was sold in 1948 to the Vinkemuller family. And anybody remember the Vinkemullers? Dale Gordon and Neil Vinkemuller. Neil Vinkemuller and at times his brother established a landscaping company called Wooden Shoe Nurseries in Coconut Creek. The Wooden Shoe came from his family, were Dutch, moved down from Michigan. Neil was an important part of the community until he He passed away 4 years ago. Had a house in South Creek, and if you go up north, there's a road called Vinca Road to commemorate them. But here comes Coconut Creek, as we begin to know it today. And this is Robert Bateman. Bateman was a native Floridian, grew up on the West Coast, went to the University of Florida. He served in the military during World War II, and then after his service, he came to South Florida, originally working at a fruit shipping company, but then he saw that the real money was in development. And so he began to work with other people and establish a development company called the Hillsborough Development Company that bought a bunch of farmland along the coast and built his project, which we know today as Lighthouse Point. He built canals and finger islands in that area and sold it at prices. When you look at the original documents there, it's like, why didn't we buy it? $38,000 for a house on the water. In any case, his development there was going so well that in 1956, Lighthouse Point was incorporated itself. But I'm going to quote him. He gave a speech in 1972 when Coconut Creek was 5 years old about how he first came to Coconut Creek, to purchasing Coconut Creek. And the light's not real great here, so bear with me. This is Bob Bateman talking. 16 years ago, that would have been 1956, one of my associates, Sterling Wright, brought into our office a listing on the Davy Moore Dairy Farm located west of the Turnpike and south of Hammondville Road. He was enthusiastic about it and suggested that I should consider buying it for a future subdivision site. I came out to look and found this beautiful pasture, high and dry with excellent drainage into the central and southern Florida flood control districts, big C-14 canal on the south. Topographical survey showed elevation up to 16 feet above sea level. By comparison, downtown Pompano is 11 feet, and the island section of Lighthouse Point is only 7 feet. The dairy cows had mowed the grass and weeds even. It looked like a well-manicured lawn. The white-coddled egrets were following the cows around, catching grasshoppers and crickets as they stirred them up. And as we drove around, we flushed a large covey of quail. What a beautiful setting. So he did buy. He bought the area that is now generally known as South Creek. At that time, there was no people living there. As he said, it had been a pasture, largely because it was kind of rocky and higher than the lowlands on the other side of Hammondville Road. This is an aerial soon after Coconut Creek development, in the 50s. And on the extreme right, you can see some little white dots. Those were the first houses that were built in Coconut Creek. But look around it in the area would be to the west or the left, all farmland. On the north side of what would be Hammondville Road, all farmland. But Bateman, working on his experience in selling Lighthouse Point, began to sell houses and lots in Coconut Creek, staging water skiing shows in the lake that he drained, Lake Julie. People would come out, park along the side of the road, sit there, watch that, and then be hounded by salesmen before they could escape. Now, Coconut Creek was a little bit of a misnomer. There was some little shallow creek beds that were dry most of the time, but most of the canals and lakes and such as that had to be built from scratch. Picture of the drag line building the main canal in Coconut Creek. The first houses that were built with the idea that this would appeal to retirees. A lot of the houses were 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a carport, no air conditioning. You can see some jealousy windows there. This house actually is located on 9th Court, steps away from my house actually, and has not been changed on the outside, except maybe the windows, at all. So it's a future historic preservation project. You can see here that if you purchased a house before it was built in Coconut Creek, you got your little sign up, and this was for Rear Admiral and Mrs. Reed. And I haven't looked up where the lot was, but you can see, if you're familiar with the houses in South Creek, you can see what model that was by the open blocks there on the breezeway. To your right was one of the first streets where the houses were built. This is Northwest 10th Street looking east with the lake behind it, and you can see Hammondville Road behind that, but look where Windmore Village is today. Again, all agriculture. This is a picture that was taken in 1960. There were about 50, maybe 50 houses in Coconut Creek. The canals were built. Still, Windmore was all agriculture. The area where Broward College is Broward College had not been built yet. And this was the original planned entrance to Coconut Creek. It wasn't where it is now on 43rd. It was on 39th. What is today the entrance to Broward College. In fact, if you go to that entrance, which you can't get anywhere except for the college to speak of, you can see the sidewalls are still there, even though the Coconut Creek sign in the middle of the road is not. Well, Bob Bateman was a visionary. He could see the possibilities, and he was kind of a little bit of his demeanor was not as a showman, but he knew what he needed to do to sell. But he wasn't a detail guy. He didn't like to get really into the nitty-gritty of house building and how much it should cost and how much, his suppliers. So he brought on board this man, Jack Brown. Jack was a little bit of a good old boy, but he was also very detailed. He knew what he could do and what he couldn't do. And in fact, a lot of people, I've talked to people who knew him, who said that, oh yeah, he was the kind of guy that if you bought a house and you said, I'd really like to move that kitchen wall, a couple feet bigger, said, oh yeah, we can do that. And, however, he was only 62 when he suffered a heart attack and died in 1971. But who to take over? His wife, Lucille Brown. Now, has anybody here ever met Lucille Brown? She was not a shrinking violet. In fact, she was, when she took over for Jack in 1971, she was the only woman in Broward County that had a contractor's license. She had actually gone to college to become a pharmacist and then worked at one time as the head of the pharmacy at Holy Cross Hospital, and then took over for Jack. She was also not as amenable to listening to people's opinions and what they wanted when she was getting the houses sold. If you wanted something done, yeah, okay, Joe, but it's going to cost you. Now, Coconut Creek began to develop. There was no real infrastructure. The only thing that was planned for it, other than the utilities, but the one community infrastructure was the park. What is today Donaldson Park. It was called Coconut Creek Park originally. And this is a picture of what it looked like from across the canal, heavily wooded, and appealing to what they thought would be their main market, the retirees. So there were shuffleboard courts, and they would have cookouts and such as that in the park. Now, there was no commercial buildings in Coconut Creek at that time. It was the only building really in Coconut Creek of a public nature was Calvary Presbyterian Church, which still exists on Coconut Creek Parkway. Although now it seems that it's primarily a rental facility for other churches. But this was the original congregation. The church land was donated to the church by an old-time farmer family, William Blunt Road. In fact, just as an aside, Lyons Road, Wiles Road, Sample Road, Blunt Road, all these are named after farm families in this area. So it's kind of a hidden message of the history that many people don't have any idea about. But the Calvary Presbyterian Church also served as a gathering spot for other groups in the community, such as the Coconut Creek Homeowners Association, which was led by this man, Gardner George. In fact, he organized the Coconut Creek Homeowners Association in the early 60s. George was looking around and seeing what was happening around Coconut Creek. Pompano Beach and Margate both filed bills in the state legislature in the mid-60s to annex Coconut Creek. And they came back again and did it again. Finally, Gardner George said, we need to do something about it. We don't want to be part of Pompano Beach, and we don't want to be part of Margate. Part of the reason for this was most of these new developments, not only Coconut Creek, but Coral Springs, Parkland, and Tamarack, were brand new developments with new roads, new infrastructure, new utilities, whereas the towns like Pompano Beach and Deerfield had significant debt and higher taxes. So the people in these developments, Lighthouse Point was an example, that we don't want to, we're buying into their debt. So they went to come up to, the only answer they came up with, or the answer they came up with was to incorporate. So in 1967, February 19, 1967, there was a vote held in the Presbyterian Church to see if the development wanted to incorporate as its own city. Now, in some ways, it was much easier back then to incorporate a city than it is today. But the rules were you needed 2/3, not 2/3 positive vote, but 2/3 of the registered voters, which in Coconut Creek, there were 240 registered voters in Coconut Creek at that time, which means they needed 160 votes for incorporation in order to incorporate. They got 163. Also, they got 98% of the registered voters to actually come out to vote on this issue. So you can see it was near and dear to their heart. So Coconut Creek, one of the first things they had to do was elect a city commission. They also elected a town marshal and clerk. That clerk, Helen Donaldson, would later get the honor of having her name affixed to the first park in Coconut Creek, Donaldson Park. This is not the first commission, but it was the first taken in the 70s, the first 5 mayors of Coconut Creek. And since some of you may know them, look going from, Jack Brown, the second man is Gardner George, Jane Mathis, Clark Shearer, and Robert Basie. What's going on here? These were the first 5 mayors of Coconut Creek. I like Mathis's white collar. Looks like he's ready to go to disco. Some of these people, I know some of them moved away, but 3 of them lived in Coconut Creek for the rest of their lives. And not that long ago, probably longer than I think, but that they passed away. At first, the city commission, or the city council, met in the Presbyterian church, but they decided they needed to get a city hall, but they had very little money and didn't want to start the city off with asking people to raise their taxes. So they were able to acquire the sales office for the Jack Brown Development Company. Actually, to the left, your left on this, that was an addition to it, but it was really like a mobile home or manufactured housing, hidden by the rocks. Very primitive, but served the purpose in the early days when there wasn't much to do. But as a change came about in the city in the early 70s, when found that people with families wanted to move to this area. And so the second phase of development in Coconut Creek was larger houses, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths often, mostly, air-conditioned houses, and beginning of recreational services for the family, recreational purposes. Ethel Rowe was the first recreation director in Coconut Creek. She didn't have any resources, and she had a pretty meager salary, which was okay because she had been doing it for free. Her husband, Jack Rowe, was on the city commission and was one of the mayors. And, well, let's see. This is what is today the Rose Center in front of Donaldson Park. People in the city said, we need to build a community center, a recreational center in the city. The city said, good idea, but we haven't got any money for that. So they had a committee get together and they decided, well, you know, if we can get enough volunteer services and volunteer money, then maybe we can do it with the very little input from the city. So they began to do it, and were successful. A lot of the blocks you see here were donated by the Women's Club. They did a bake sale to buy blocks for it. A lot of the laying of the blocks and the things that didn't require, you know, things like electricity and stuff like that, were done by local residents. Jack Rowe is the man in the middle. I'm not sure who the other 2 are. I think the one on the left might have been a city commissioner, but I haven't been able to figure him out. I mentioned the Women's Club. That was the first organization in the city. It was founded in 1970. Primarily, one of the big impetus for it to be incorporated itself was the recreation center that we just talked about, to raise money for that. But then they began to get into other things. They were the first ones to do Santa's visit and the Christmas party, Santa's brunch. Also, their other big starting off thing was Easter egg hunt in the city every year. In addition to after we got the recreation center done, much of their money went and continues to this day into scholarships for Coconut Creek residents. Another volunteer project was Hosford Park in Coconut Creek. The school board leased land to the city for a park that could have baseball and sports fields, and local volunteers pretty much did the work. The man standing there with a stick prodding his volunteers on is Jack Hosford, who became the chief of police in Coconut Creek in 1971. He was only 46 years old, however, when he died of a heart attack in 1979. And the park that he was building is today known as Hosford Park. He wasn't the first sheriff or first chief of police, but he was a very popular person in the Creek. Coconut Creek Schools, as the area developed, 2 schools came online, or actually 3. Coconut Creek Elementary was established in, let me make sure I got that right, 1968. I should know that, my kids are there. And Coconut Creek High School in January of 1972. You can see on the right, as sort of the heritage of the area, there was an agriculture club at Coconut Creek High School. This was a picture from, the one on the right, picture from their yearbook. Now, can you imagine today a picture like this happening? It would be the ATF and FBI and everybody else down there. But the Coconut Creek High School also produced some good athletic teams. They was the women's state champs in 1984. They won it twice, and the boys won the state champs for soccer also. Also in 1972, Broward College, what is today Broward College, started going. The land just west of the Turnpike, where Broward College is today, had been designated by the school board early in 1960 for a branch campus of what was then Broward Junior College. But in 1972, they actually got going, and these were the first 2 buildings that were built on the campus. You can see a lot of empty land there. They got going, they were really pushing it, and they didn't get everything quite done on time, including the parking lot. If any of you remember, when they opened Broward College and Broward Community College and was becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, the traffic on Coconut Creek Parkway in the morning and in the afternoon when people were going back and forth was horrible. There was no Atlantic Boulevard that went through. There was no Copans Road that went through. So between Cypress Creek was open back then. Let's say it wasn't. Between Commercial Boulevard and Sample Road, Coconut Creek was the only way between the west and the east. As those other roads opened, it helped out quite a bit. Now, up to now, we've been talking about Coconut Creek as only what is today South Creek. And that's because as it was building, there was nothing else except agriculture. But then a man by the name of Ross Cortese had his eyes on some of this agricultural land. He had been working on building adult communities in California and had a lot of negative about it, but he was successful and proposed to build one here in Coconut Creek. I don't think, one of the truisms of any sort of thing, and I'm sure everybody's worked with the city would attest to this, anytime anything new, no matter how benign, is suggested, there are going to be people that do not like this. So with a proposal for this, they ran into a lot of problems with the city commission that were opposed to the density and the whole adult community sort of thing. But they own the land, they had the right to build, and they built. So this is one of the early built Rossmore, which later it was purchased and became Winmore Village in the early 70s. One of the people who came to Coconut Creek, although he didn't live in Coconut Creek, who was instrumental in a lot of things, not sort of, which I say below the surface, was a man with a rather interesting name, Roy Rogers. As he said, no one ever forgets my name. He was a young golf course designer, working for a golf course designer, and had been a submariner in the Navy. For a while, when Winmore began to get going, at one point it had about 6,000 residents, and there was maybe 6,000 residents in the rest of the city. And there was a tremendous amount of animosity between Winmore and the rest. Winmore, a lot of them felt that the city was behind the times and was being controlled by,
farmers.
not in their interest. The residents in the single-family homes said, Winmore wants to control everything. And eventually they did, but only for a short time. Once the township built up, then nobody had a population that was in charge of the population, and things simmered down a little bit. By 1980s, the town had grown large enough that the city council decided that they would get rid of their strong mayor form of government and hire a city manager. There was a couple city managers that one of them quit almost immediately, and the other one had no training as a city manager, and kind of things fumbled around, and he retired before he was let go. A popular thing. The third city manager that we had was a young, 34 years old, Leonard Matarese, whose background was largely in police, but he had, got a master's in public administration or anything like that. He was, say it elsewhere, supremely confident in his decisions and his vision. He was better on the second than the former. He was not a people person and antagonized a lot of people, but he was right more than he was wrong. He had the vision that the city would have to expand, that it would have to have a staff that was paid on par with other cities in the area, that it could not rely on volunteers for special things like fire protection, and so we got rid of the volunteer fire department, which was a huge battle. But as I say, he consolidated a lot of the power in his office, but was able to get things done, and things that really needed to be done for the transition from kind of, I would say, was a volunteer-based community to a modern government. Still, there were a few things from the city that he didn't get rid of. Horse patrol is gone now, but it was one of the later
Looks like a donkey.
hangers on. Also, if you remember seeing the picture of the city hall, the old city hall, as the city expanded, this wasn't going to work at all. So really, in quite a few years before, they began to plan for a new city hall that would go more centrally located in the city as it annexed land farther and farther north. The area that was decided upon was the corner of Copens Road and Copens Road and Lyons Road. And the city manager that took Matarisa's place, Dennis Neely, this is a picture of him in 1984 at the groundbreaking for our city government center. A picture of the final, which surprised a lot of people how it blended in with the residential nature. There was a lot of people at the time who were very suspicious of a big city hall or government center, as you will. And we're going to skip ahead a little bit. I wanted to bring us up to when the city began to get kind of boring. Everybody doing everything really good and planning ahead and all that sort of stuff. So you don't have the characters that you used to. Few. I see Wayne back there. Still in the 80s, Butterfly World, which opened in 1988. This is getting ready. I don't know who the people are there. But Ron Boimler, he was an electrical engineer who retired and got interested in butterflies and kind of made that as an application. He was in England and met a guy who was like the world's authority on butterflies, and saw that they had a butterfly house in London. So he came back to the United States and said, we need one here, and found Tradewinds Parks and convinced people to fund the project, a nonprofit, and built Butterfly World, which of course led to Coconut Creek becoming the butterfly capital of the world. Now, as the Seinfeld once said, I don't know how official this is, but nobody else has claimed that, and we've got good reason, because Butterfly World is the largest butterfly aviary in the world. So, until someone argues with us, it's ours. This led, of course, to great branding opportunities with the Butterfly Festival and Butterfly Run. But it also infused the city, again, with a sense of environmental protection, a green environment, not just a lot of pavement and buildings, but make it a livable city that I think we all enjoy living in. So with that, I will turn it back over to,
Right to here.
okay. Sorry.
Thank you, Hiram. Wasn't that a wonderful presentation? Let's give him a big round of applause.